Hello, and thank you very much for asking me to speak on the topic of considering medical education. My name's Professor Jo Szram, and I am the RCP Linacre Fellow, which I'll explain later, and also Postgraduate Dean of Kent, Surrey and Sussex on behalf of Health Education England. And I'm giving a pretty personal view with some information for you to consider how medical education could form part of your career as a consultant. I've put my RCP email and also my Twitter handle on this slide, and I'm very happy to be contacted afterwards, and we'll be joining you for a Q&A shortly. So when considering taking on something like medical education, it's important to remember that all of life has a form of balance to it. So work and life, as it were, within work, clinical and non-clinical responsibilities, responsibilities of research, perhaps, or leadership as well. So there is only so much one person can carry, and what may unbalance this very delicate equipoise must be considered quite carefully. And all of my life, I've had to balance different roles. So as a new consultant, I was clinical across 2 different services. And then I became an educator and a supervisor. I ended up at one point supervising about 16 trainees, which, by the way, I don't recommend. And then became a program director and then a director of medical education at my trust. And then a deputy dean in another part of London, and then went into a national role at the same time picking up the RCP Linacre Fellow role, which is a appointed and remunerated role at college, where you have responsibility for looking after college tutors and associate college tutors across the whole of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And most recently, in July, I became Postgraduate Dean for Kent, Surrey and Sussex. And so at each point where I've taken on a role or lost a role, I've had to think really carefully about how I manage that and my clinical work. And I've had to, for example, remove any research responsibilities from my job plan and timetable. I've had to cut my clinical commitments down. So at each point, one wins and loses, and it's really important to think about that in the round. The most recent role I've actually taken on at my trust is as clinical appraisal lead, and there I look at job planning and appraisal output from my over 200 consultant colleagues at Royal Brompton and Harefield hospitals. And it's really interesting to see how people make decisions about what they're going to take on as years pass. And I've been a consultant now 11 years, and each year has been a bit different. And I really hope sincerely that you also have different years, because that variety brings a lot of energy and learning in terms of self-development. So how can one become a medical educator? Well, the first thing to say is a lot of people involved in the management of doctors in training in the NHS. And so actually there's loads of opportunities to get involved. Here is our attempt in another organisation that I look after in what I call my hobby role as chair, now emeritus chair of the National Association of Clinical Tutors, otherwise known as Medical Education Leaders. So one of the things I did as a chair was rebranded the organisation with my council. And we tried to capture all the people involved in education at postgraduate level. And here you can see a trainee at the bottom left of the diagram learning things, and the roles most immediate to that of clinical and educational supervisor. And those are pretty much the first and easiest jobs to take on, because we all recall having those supervisors, learning good and bad aspects of supervision from them. And it's relatively easy as a senior trainee or early stage consultant to get on a supervisor training course and learn a bit more about the nuts and bolts of that, and also the more general approaches to supervision, which is a role of both performance, so how's a trainee getting on, and will they meet their targets, and development, which is, actually where do they want to be and how can I help them. And that's the best thing about supervisory roles really in medical education, is you get to do both things and really help lots of people in their future career. And then if you like that, you can pretty much choose something around the program director roles, which might be in foundation, if you have a lot of foundation trainees that you work with, or perhaps in internal medicine or what used to be core medical training, and then higher specialty, of which obviously physicians have over 20. So there's plenty of scope there and opportunity. And higher up those hierarchies, we have the deputy deans and postgraduate deans. And then there's a whole area in the middle of this diagram about support and professional development, where you can see people who work more either locally as specialty or college tutors. I'll come to that role shortly. Looking at the culture in a department and whether a learning environment exists, to support the supervisors and trainers as well as the learners, to run faculty groups, to learn and share good practice, and to support the organisation in delivering on quality control and assurance. And then there are other roles in many organisations as deputies or associates to the Director of Medical Education, where you can take on stimulation, clinical skills, looking after doctors who need specific additional support, developing faculty, or developing skills in careers, coaching and counselling. And all of these come with personal development opportunities around other roles, which will prove really valuable to you in both your personal development, but also in clinical and leadership roles in the future. And that's the good thing about education. It will give you transferable skills for any other field of professional practice. And then obviously there are some regulatory roles on the right, and I mentioned my role as a clinical appraisal lead, which fits much more into governance. There are clinical directors there, many of whom will have been senior educators before they take those roles on. And there you're looking at patient safety, but also professional regulation around GMC responsibilities. And that's a whole nother area that one can get involved in within education in the NHS at the moment. So what other roles are there? So I've sort of tried to split them into postgraduate and undergraduate, and I have more familiarity with postgraduate roles, but I have also taken undergraduate ones. So I'll just sort of go through them briefly and explain what they might bring to you in your career. So the college tutor role is a really powerful starter in terms of a leadership role. And there are over 200 college tutors across the college networks. They are looked after and supported by both administrators and regional advisors in their area, as well as myself as Linacre Fellow, to provide that guidance. And the good thing about that role is that it's really evolved as the deaneries have changed from being administered more by college systems into the NHS under Health Education England. Those roles have been integrated, and often those college tutors act as the internal medicine training local programme director, a bit like a foundation programme director in a trust. So it's a really good supported role to get into, and the college gives a lot of development opportunity through that role too. There's also the suggestion that you should have one PA of time to fulfil that role, and I work with my college tutors to ensure they do have the time to do so. Education shouldn't be done around the sides of other things, and whilst it's really difficult to get job plans right, it's important to have at least some defined time for educational roles. And that's where you learn your negotiation skills to sort your job plan out. There are, of course, a huge group of doctors who don't sit within formal training programmes. Many people now take time out of programme between different programmes like foundation into core or internal medicine, and then between internal medicine and higher. And those are LEDs, or locally employed doctors, as common parlance, and they still need development and education, and therefore need leads in their education. A bit less pressure because there aren't annual ARCPs, but at the same time getting people into the correct careers, supporting them and helping them manage the difficulties of not being in a training programme is a really valuable role. SAS leads are generally SAS doctors themselves. Some of you tuning in may be SAS doctors, and increasingly college is working to bring consultant and SAS leads together in order to understand that we all have our paths in development, and everybody is equally valued, certainly by college as an organisation. And our national SAS lead, Jamie Reid, is a very experienced educator and just become Dean of a medical school as an SAS doctor. So the future is very bright in education and leadership, and it offers a huge amount of career opportunity for you all. There are also other opportunities. In England, we have supported return to training as a funded programme with leads both within trusts and schools. We have Guardian of Safe Working, which is an NHS employer responsibility rather than one through education, but looks after our doctors in training due to the 2016 contract, so looking at rotas, hours and educational opportunities in tandem with the Director of Medical Education. Then there are roles around champion of flexible working to ensure that people can work less than full time, change their hours and working patterns to suit them and their responsibilities that they may have, or just the way that they need to work. So things are changing there. There are also some more broad all-staff roles such as the Wellbeing Guardian and the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian, which are again provider responsibilities to have someone who has responsibility for that. And whilst this isn't strictly education, it impacts everything around the learning environment that one would expect. I'm just going to talk briefly about undergraduates. So many of you will work with trusts that host medical students, and therefore trusts require a number of consultants to take responsibility for their experience in the organisation. So you might choose to be a mentor, you might choose to support tuition, that might be clinical or non-clinical. So for example, there are problem-based and team-based learning programmes that require tutors, and clinical skills laboratories and other work with students, which can be really valuable and really rewarding to spend time with undergraduate learners. There may be an area of medicine that you would be particularly keen to lecture on or facilitate workshops, and I just encourage you to talk to people in your department who are already involved with medical student placements and are normally incredibly keen to have further support with that work. We're only going to have more medical students, so it's a really fertile ground. And the advantage of working with undergraduates is that generally one can develop clinical skills with association of either a PG certificate or another qualification or courses that universities will provide for their educators to allow them to teach their students. And then I haven't really talked about other roles such as physician associates and other healthcare professionals. Again, they all need tutors and support at undergraduate level and then into postgraduate. So these are all areas that one can get involved in education. The basic skills of education and how to deliver teaching and training are, of course, transferable, and one can be an educational generalist, which is probably a great place to start as a young consultant. But as you develop, you can choose which string of your bow to develop more. I will add a few life lessons. So your plan might be listening to me, oh, I know exactly what I want to do about this. But of course, reality gets in the way. And for me, my career trajectory has been probably more like the bottom picture than the top. So please don't worry about that. I still ended up being a dean at the end of it, which is slightly surprising when I stopped to think about it. But there were many moments along there where I thought, I'm not sure this is ever going to work, or I've taken too much on and I'm not sure I can manage. So don't feel, if you make a decision it's not right for you and you need to perhaps change your mind and change direction, it really doesn't matter. And for example, I really thought I would be quite a committed researcher and have a more of a clinical academic pathway, but it just didn't work for me for various reasons. And nothing bad has happened as a result. I learned a lot. I still got a lot of academic skills from that as a postdoctoral worker. And I just encourage you to try things out and make sure you give time to yourself to be honest about how you're getting on and whether it's the right thing for you. We've all been through these things. Everybody has. And if you ever need to talk through anything with someone, always make sure you find someone to talk to. Having a few mentors is really valuable. So I've given you lots of choices to how to choose. You could make one of these if you like. My kids are slightly obsessed with making these at the moment, but you may want to choose in a bit more of a structured way. So let's have a think about how we might do that. So just a little bit about how those different roles might link. And some of you listening may be thinking, I'm not really that into education, but I do fancy myself as a leader. I do want to be a clinical director or a medical director, or maybe I want to do some more research. So the same applies for most things. It's really important to understand how roles and responsibilities fit in. And this is how education can actually help you with leadership or research activity. So we have our trainers right in the middle. We put them at the centre of what we think about, and we know that they need supervision. So being a supervisor of a trainee can be really productive for you as well as for them. So you learn your skills of education, but also of management, because you are effectively managing them. You learn mentoring skills. You learn to sometimes have quite challenging conversations, and you can choose how challenging to be. And you also learn about how to manage and fit within a structure. And so actually, being a supervisor is probably one of the most valuable roles that one can take on as a consultant. You also learn from your trainees. I mean, I've had trainees who have gone on to amazing academic achievements. Many of them are now practicing consultants with academic roles, and it's incredibly rewarding to see them succeed in that way, whilst also still continuing with my own career. So it's a win-win. You can see that leadership roles therefore turn up within, as I said, the foundation school, or perhaps in your specialty, and you may choose to lead education and training for a period of time in your own faculty group, and you'll learn therefore team management skills and how to set strategy and direction. And obviously the Director of Medical Education role, which is one of the best roles that I've ever held in my trust, is probably the pinnacle of that within educational leadership in organisations. But many medical directors were DMEs in the past, and so it's a really great pipeline for developing those senior leadership skills. And then equally, one can go down the other route of looking specifically at a training programme, becoming a head of school. Interaction with college gets greater there, particularly with the Joint Royal College Postgraduate Training Board, the JRCPTB, understanding how curricula are set and assessed, how exams are managed, and other federated activity. And then obviously within the NHS structures now, the quality of learning environments and putting the trainee and therefore the patient at the heart of those decisions is something that I find really rewarding as a dean, to make sure that my trainees are learning how to give the best possible care to the patients. The responsible officer role is a particularly interesting one because it spans these different domains of management within medical leadership. So when a trainee is within an organisation, I am their responsible officer as dean, but they work in an organisation that has a medical director as responsible officer, and so we link together there. And so I learn an awful lot from my colleague medical directors within my deanery about how they're managing local fitness to practice issues. And again, everything ends up being connected at some point or other, and we always have an opportunity to learn from each other in these roles. Another life lesson slide. If you've never heard of Brené Brown, do check her out. She's very widely published. There are lots of videos and blogs and things from her. She's an American research professor. She talks a lot about authenticity, hence this slide. And within that, she talks about how you have to be courageous to be authentic, and you have to dare to show yourself and allow other people to see your failings and to be able to trust them, because actually we all fail, we all do something less well than we'd like to. And the best feedback I've ever had is from colleagues where I've said to them, how do you think that went? I don't think that went particularly well. Can you try and help me work out what I could have done differently? What was it that, didn't work so well? So being honest and having people around you who are comfortable being honest with you is one of the best leadership lessons that I've ever learned. And I've been absolutely honoured to work with a number of leaders like that. As Linacre Fellow, I report into the registrar, and I was recruited by the late and great Professor Donal O'Donoghue, and I now work for Catherine Edwards, and they were both very authentic leaders, very different, but very authentic. And that's been an absolute pleasure, and I shall miss the role because I have to give it up very much. Stress is a factor. How you perceive stress, how you respond to stress, what stress means to you, and a lifelong battle, I think. Education does offer, for me, a form of stress relief from clinical tensions, because it's not as immediate. The need to care for someone in training is very different to caring for a patient who's unwell. And so for me, has been a really useful way of balancing some very intense clinical situations. That's not to say that education comes without stress. There are times of year like ARCPs where things get really tricky, or a trainee comes with some really significant personal circumstances that you need to help them deal with. But actually being there with them is a really rewarding part of the job. So when you take on a new role, whether it's educational or otherwise, just think about how you manage issues of stress and how you will mitigate those as you adapt your job plan, because there's always a period of wiggle where you have to think a bit about how it's all going to work. And grit. So Angela Duckworth's a social scientist too from America. She wrote a book called Grit. That's one of the many covers. And she looked in depth at why some people succeed, despite not necessarily being the most skilled or the most intellectually intelligent. They are more likely to succeed. And she discovered that grit, or the ability to persevere despite obstacles in order to get to where you want to, so you could call it tenacity, or gut in a more colloquial way, is a really important characteristic. And it's a great book. You can watch her TED Talk if you're not really into reading big books. And I heard her lecture when I went to a really good leadership course at Harvard Macy in Boston 4 or 5 years ago now. A really amazing lady, and some great evidence behind this concept that persevering is important. And one of the things I learned about that is you can persevere much better with something you really, really care about. And I think that's where I learned why I didn't become a researcher and why I became an educator, because education is something that I care about doing much more than research, which I found really frustrating. And so I wasn't able to persevere perhaps as well as I might. And it's important to know yourself and what works for you. But for me, that was a really groundbreaking concept. And I encourage you to think about what really makes you dig in and persevere, because it's an important trait. And we all have it. Everyone who gets through medicine and becomes a consultant has grit. The question is how you use it. This is one that I commonly encounter when people say, I don't think I can do this job. And obviously, as a director of medical education, I was always asking people to do jobs. And they say, well, I don't think I can do it. I'm not sure I'm good enough. But I would just like to say that we all feel imposter syndrome. I still feel imposter syndrome when I go into particular rooms as a dean or as an Linacre fellow. And, that's because I know who I am, and I know I'm not in any way perfect. As the picture on the left shows, I'm awkward. I'm a bit crazy sometimes. I sometimes try too hard. I have some talents, but I know where I lack talent, and I don't tend to tell people that, but I know about it anyway. But actually on the outside, people think, oh, Jo's all right. She just kind of knows what she's talking about, and she seems really nice. And if she doesn't know, she goes and checks. And so actually, no one really thinks I'm a fraud. There are ways and means of managing imposter syndrome, but the main thing is to remember that it's completely natural and you don't have to be perfect. And if you try hard and you put effort in and it's something you care about, that will come across and people will support you and help you. And in every single role I've taken on in education, that has been the case. So a bit more nitty-gritty. How do I do this, Jo? Well, to be able to take on an educator role at a high level at the RCP, you have to understand the RCP. This took me some time. So the story of how I came into any of my RCP roles relates to becoming a fellow. And a colleague of mine at work said he would support me to become a fellow, but only if I stood for council, because there weren't enough women on council. And he made me promise that I would stand for election as soon as I could after fellowship. And I always honour my promises, so I did. And then I got elected, which was a bit of a surprise to me. But then I turned up at council and I didn't really know what to do. My imposter syndrome was through the roof at that point. The only thing that really saved me was that Bod Goddard, who was then registrar at the council, was there, and he was my med reg when I was an SHO back in Nottingham many years ago. And I thought, well, if Bod can be the registrar of college, then I can probably be on council. but I had no idea what I was doing or what my role was. And so I dug in to try and find out what the RCP was. And in doing so, met some amazing people who are listed here. I mean, the shortcut really is that there are 4 directorates that you can become involved in as a fellow or consultant. And they're on the left here. So my directorate, as I like to call it, is Message, that supports membership and global engagement. So you can see I'm in there as Linacre Fellow, along with the Global Vice President, the Welsh Vice President, some of the people I've mentioned already, like the SAS lead. We have the faculty president of the Physician Associates in there, and that's run by the registrar. And so it's not actually an educational directorate. As you can see, I've put that at the bottom of the list there, which is run by my friend and colleague, Professor Anya Burns. She's a DME in London. I've known her for a very long time. And the chief examiner, Celia Bilavsky, who I've known again when we were DMEs together, and she's now chief examiner. So it just goes to show that you can start off in education and end up pretty much anywhere if you want to. And a number of the censors are very much newer fellows and have come through the college leadership programs such as Emerging Women Leaders. So don't ever feel that these are unattainable roles. They're really interesting roles. You learn a lot, you meet a lot of amazing people, and it's really about what you think is most interesting to you. So I haven't really mentioned the 2 in the middle, but the clinical quality improvement directorate looks obviously at clinical care, and that's now run by John Dean and was Sarah Clark, who's now our president. And then the academic vice president looks after communications policy and research and runs the conference. And actually everybody on here runs some form of conference or other. So meetings and conferences are another thing. If you're keen on those, lots of opportunity to help running those. Then there's a federated work, which I mentioned earlier. So you have within that the JRCPTB, and that looks after curriculum training and also exams through MRCP UK. But there's also the CPD, Continuing Professional Development arm, that looks after diary and accreditation. And there's a little section that looks internationally at education and training as well. And that's run jointly by the 3 Royal Colleges of London, Glasgow and Edinburgh, and is again an area where one can get involved heavily within education and learn an awful lot. So what I've done on this slide is kept my original how is the college made up and thought about some of the roles one can take on to see what college looks like at your stage, where to start basically. So College Tutors is a brilliant place to start, as mentioned, lots of support. You learn a lot, you know a lot, and you bring information into college. It's a really ambassadorial role, and I thoroughly recommend it. You can also become an MRCP, particularly PACES examiner. We need lots of those. Training has started again post-pandemic, so definitely think about that. Then if you're interested in how your region works and you want to take a role, there's a regional advisor, and for specialty, regional specialty advisors. I haven't really talked about specialist societies, but again, they all have education departments or parts to their working. So mine is the British Thoracic Society, because I'm a respiratory physician, and I was on the Education and Training Committee of that for a bit as a trainee, and then also as a consultant, and a great place to learn more about education. You can volunteer to write questions for written exams, or you can take on roles around what they call censor, which is where you take on particular briefs like flexible portfolio training or other such initiatives. And finally, there are lots of editorial boards. So I'm on the Future Healthcare Journal editorial board as an associate editor, and we have a bunch of trainees, consultants, healthcare professionals, policy experts on that board. I learn an awful lot when we have our meetings. Loads of places that medical education can figure in very obvious ways or less obvious ways. What about offers to you? You're saying, this is all great, Jo, but I don't have the skills, I don't have the knowledge, where do I get it? So RCP's got a few offers, and it would be silly of me not to mention those. The one we're most proud of is our newest, which is called RCP Launchpad, and that started just this summer, and it features myself and Shruti Konda, who has been the new consultant rep for London for a little while now, and we did a little video about becoming a supervisor, so you can see what we learned about the experience and what we think is useful for you to think about when you're considering taking the role on. And there are a bunch of other videos on there that you can have a look at with other resources. You can, if you're not really into videos, there's written material and links to other information. So please have a look at that and give us some idea of what else you think needs to go into it as we fill up the resources and make it a really comprehensive place to start. That's the point, the clue's in the name. On the left, I've just listed some of the courses that the RCP Education Directorate offers specifically for education, teaching, supervision and assessment. And they also run new consultant courses such as 6 Steps and leadership courses such as Doctor as Leader and Emerging Women Leaders and other courses for CPD. So there are lots of offers within college, so I encourage you to have a look at those. You'll also receive from your deanery various opportunities, which vary very much by region and country. And your trust may also have development courses. So it's important to have a look at all of those offers. And I mentioned previously university, so your partner medical school will have educator qualifications specifically. My final plug for my organisation for Medical Education Leaders UK, previously known as NACT, National Association of Clinical Tutors UK. We have a new website, which I've put on here. The meeting registrations are on the old NACT website, and I've put a link here for the winter meeting, which is running at RCP London face-to-face on the 25th of November. And you'd be very welcome to attend. There's some information there, a really diverse programme. We're talking a lot about diversity and inclusivity issues within education and other thorny and challenging topics. So that's how you develop yourself. Go along to these things, hear what other people are saying, and you'll find that you will also have something to contribute to this amazing and diverse field. So in summary, becoming an educator, you need to ask yourself some questions. Would you like education to be another string to your bow? Is now the right time? Is a bit later? What opportunities have been perhaps presented to you? Is now the good time? Is it the right opportunity? How confident are you about education? Do you know much about the theory? Do you have much practice in education? By the time I was asked to be a supervisor, I'd already been doing a lot of undergraduate teaching. So for me, it didn't seem quite so alarming, but I did need support in learning how the new portfolio worked because I hadn't been on a portfolio electronic system. I was in the paper system, makes me sound ancient. So you know, there are always things that one can learn. And then ask some more general questions of yourself after this talk. What kind of jobs do you like the sound of? Why do you like them? And then the important question, how will you fit it in? Because there's only so many hours in the day, and generally people like to see their family and have hobbies and interests outside of work. And then once you've got some ideas and some questions for other people, who is it you can go and to speak to? And a college tutor is a great place to start. But you can also go to your postgrad centre. They have amazing managers often, and the Director of Medical Education as well. And if you're not sure, contact your new consultant committee reps, or you can contact me directly because I've given you both my email and my Twitter handle. So my advice, go for it. You won't regret it. And the reason for that is that you will help others learn and develop, and you will learn and develop a lot too. Thank you very much.